There had been a moment interview where Davian saw something in Clarisse. The old woman's eyes had suddenly burned with purpose, as though a greater power had slipped into her wrinkled skin to stare out at this presumptuous cog worshipper. She had turned on the man, made demands, and he had acquiesced, with a slightly bewildered look on his face. Hope had surged in Davian's heart. Was it all an act? Are we manipulating them? But then he had gone, and Clarisse sagged back, like a structure falling in on itself. She sucked at her gums and stared at nothing, hollowed out and weary. Give out the word, she whispered to the aunt and the uncle at her shoulders. Tell them that it is the Emperor's will we will take up our weapons. The Machine Priest's Ascension Day is to be our day. Succeed or fail. Go and tell all the congregation that we rise against them. It must be now, or it will be never. She let herself be helped to her feet, and somewhere in the process, a spine clicked into place, and her next words came out with fire. Tell the aunts and uncles, tell the great aunts and the great uncles, summon our eldest from their nests. Pass word to every clave where the congregation keeps a chapel. Go to all who bear our blood, and all who don't, but will hear our message. Tell the forge tenders and the factorum stewards that we march on the Palladium tomorrow. Tell them every death between the teeth of the machines, every sibling crushed in a collapsed shaft, every child sick of their poisons will be avenged tomorrow, or not at all. Have them rise with us, and tell them they will see marvels. And people rushed from the room to carry out her orders, even as more came to see what the shouting was about. And Davian stood back and felt ill, because all of this was a sham, surely. It was the prompting of one of the enslavers. They were nothing but a plaything of the tech priests, and they were going to take up their meager arms against the mechanized might of the adepts. The streets of Octorites would be awash with the blood of her kin. When all the messengers had rushed off, Davian shook her head bitterly. I have brought this about, she managed, fighting back the urge to sweep at her own weakness. I wanted to save Neem. I brought the end of us. Child, Clarisse said, but Davian skittered away from her, refusing to let herself be comforted. This is the end of us, she hissed. The priest will use us, and then he will destroy us, or imprison us in his jars and make us his experiments. In all our ways, all our traditions, all our faith, he will melt it out of us. There will be nothing left but his science. Child, Clarisse repeated. We should flee, Davian almost shouted at her. All of us, each to a different hole. We should abandon the city. We should carry our words and our blood to other places. We're finished here. I'm sorry, Magus. We're finished. And she was simultaneously weeping and incandescent with rage. At herself, at Triskelion, at Clarisse. I have ruined us. I am a traitor. Punish me, Magus. Destroy me. You have listened to the lies of the enemy. It is true, Clarisse said softly. Her hand fell on Davian's shoulder. A husk of a thing. No weight to it. And you may be punished in time. That is also true. But for now, you are one of us. And you must play your part in what is to come. But it's a sham, Davian exclaimed. It's some taskmaster plan, some infighting between them. It isn't the time. Struck by a sudden hope, she searched the old woman's face. Is it? Is is all this the Emperor's plan for us? Can it be? And before she could hear any more empty comforts, she rushed on. Tell me truly, Magus. Please tell me. The sad calm on Clarissa's face was heartbreaking. I don't know, child. I wish I could give you all the grand certainties in the world. I wish I could give you the words of fire and faith I'd speak in the chapel of the many-handed Emperor and his angels. But that is what faith is for, Davian, she sagged, sinking in on herself a little more. Take me in to my chamber. I must rest before tomorrow. You can't take to the streets, Magus. Not you. I must. We all shall play our part. We shall triumph together, or we shall fall. I do not want to be left alone if my kin are taken from me. Davian led her deeper into the maze of cellars. All around, the congregation were in a frenzy of preparation. The building was hemorrhaging the faithful as they rushed out to carry the Magus' words across the poor districts of the city. Out there, all Davian's distant kin would be arming themselves, and the others, all those who weren't blood, but who had suffered between the crushing iron boot of the tech priests. They'd be gathering too, all of them, cast against the iron walls of the Hollowmen. And when she had Clarisse back to the old woman's bed, she helped her lie down, hearing joints click and crack. The Magus lay there, staring at the low ceiling, then shifting her head to look at the painting of the Emperor on the far wall. It was flaking now, half obscured with grime, a depiction from the time of the great aunts and uncles, when the blood of the Emperor was stronger in them, so that none of the congregation would show their faces for fear of being known for what they were. A figure with 4 arms, 2 human hands, and with 2 radiant claws like crescent moons, an elliptical head split by a great benevolent smile that was all teeth. The eyes were beatific, murderous, inhuman. Davian had stared at the image often, feeling out its contradictions, letting them speak to her human part and her inhuman part. It frightened her. It inspired her. I hear them singing to me, Clarissa's dry voice rose to her. The angels. They throng the cold void, and I sing back. I tell them, we are here. We are faithful. We are waiting for you. And their great wings carry them across the freezing spaces, through the perilous labyrinth of the warp. They are coming, Davian. They tell me, we hear you. We come for you. Only have faith, and you shall become a part of us. She laughed softly, coughed, shuddering with each dry convulsion. They came from the stars, our ancestors. The first Amarad to bear our blood was an angel's child, and so we are the children of angels, but weaker. Each generation, I lack the strength of the aunts, the might of the great aunts. I am too human to be truly strong, but I hear them, Davian. They are so beautiful. There is nothing on this ugly world to compare to them. I need to see them with my own eyes before I grow too old. And Davian, one of the diminished survivors of a younger generation still, thought about how thin her own blood was, how little of the angel remained. Do you think the priest's Ascension Day will be our Ascension too? Or will all our blood just end up on the streets and in that priest's laboratory? Clarissa's yellow eyes switched to her. Faith is all that we have. When the machinery of this world comes to crush us, I hear angels. they come to us. But space is vast, and the warp is a trickster. All we can do is believe that the many-handed emperor will not abandon his faithful in their time of need, that he is a true divinity, beyond the enthroned corpse, the machine gods worship. Our God lives, Davian. Our God is life. Life in all its many forms and guises. Theirs is dust and ancient mechanisms. We must prevail, or we give the universe over to entropy and death. Only by our truths can life eternal survive and spread throughout the cosmos. Do you understand me, child? Do you have faith? And Davian thought, we are going to die tomorrow, on the streets and in their arena. This is not the true uprising we were promised. It is some priest's gambit. But she couldn't hold to those thoughts against the old woman's rustle of a voice. It got under her skin. It spoke to all those services and the buried chapel. It spoke to her blood. Easy to have faith when you are strong, after all. And what was the value of it then? But they stood under the steel hammer of the tech priests, and they would rise up nonetheless. Let Triskelion think it was all his plan. The congregation would rise because it was their time. Who said that he was using them? And even though intellectually she knew the truth, she still felt that fire in her that burned away all doubt. I believe, Magus, she said fiercely. Tell me what to do. Every single thing that I say or do. Time goes by so slowly. That Madonna song is pretty good. You should listen to it. It's called Hung Up. Pretty good. The next dawn, even as the tech priests were attending their early Ascension Day devotions, the streets of the South Chasm districts erupted into armed uprising. Davian saw it from the rooftops, crossing from building to building by the gantries, bridges and ropes that Skitari had periodically brought down, but the locals always strung up again. All night, the congregation's messengers had been running like sparks through the poorer districts of the city, seeing which claves would catch their fires. All of the true faithful rose up without question, of course. Right now, she could only see the more inarguably human of them, those marked only by a pallidity of skin, scratches of chitinous scales, unblinking yellow eyes, perhaps. No unusual traits on as poisonous a world as this. Behind and within the walls of the tenements, though, the older generations of the God-touched would be stirring, would be eager. They had waited all their long lives, after all. They had hidden away as their younger offspring had busied themselves in the world, unable to show their distorted faces. They had known only the burning of fire and faith, and now that faith told them, rise. The streets were thronging with people, just ordinary people, and yet not ordinary. For many of those bodies, a few drops of divine blood ran. But they were not the superhuman figures of imperial myth, not the Adeptus Astartes that had been made into little gods, not the tech priests elevated by machinery until they had forgotten what it was like to have 2 living feet on the ground. People with nothing but their faith and what tools and weapons they could scavenge or make themselves. And today they would attempt to wrest control of their destiny from those who had ordered and limited their whole lives. And they would die, she knew. Heavy-hearted, she watched them muster. Factorum workers clapping each other on the shoulder. Hard greetings called across the crowd. There were banners here, and some were of the many-handed emperor, scattering his angels among the faithful. But there were others too. Crude standards, celebrating this ward, or that factorum, this mining crew. Even one for the staff of a workers' refectory. There was an air of a festival, just as if they were celebrating the damned Ascension Day after all. And then the first Qatari came into sight. Davian knew she should be away by now, off on the errand that Clarisse had given her. But she couldn't. She had to see if the whole venture would collapse into tragedy. A wedge of red-clad cybernetic soldiers ordered itself precisely across the street ahead of the gathering mob. Behind them, a pair of dragoons stalked in, towering over the soldiers' heads. Their riders crouched forked lances, snapping with sparks, even as the servitor beneath them merged with the workings of the machine, directed the Iron Strider's jerky motions. The crowd stilled, seeing all those carbines level at them, knowing more would be on the way. The Skitarii Alpha called out, voice amplified until it rattled on Davian's skull like thunder. By the order of the Fabricator General, you are required to disperse. There will be no second warning. And Clarisse stepped forwards from the ranks of the crowd, standing ahead of them, raising her staff. Somehow, her high, clear voice carried even to Davian. Faith and freedom. Faith for the true Emperor's blood. Freedom from the yoke. And the Skitarii opened fire. Davian screamed when they did it, curled away from the blaze and heat of it, knowing that this was surely the end, even as the uprising began. But in the echo of the shots, she dared look and saw Clarisse somehow untouched, standing with bodies to her left and right. The faithful had put themselves in harm's way, and not so many bodies even, not compared to the vast mass of humanity that was packing the street. Angry humanity, crammed with grievances. Clarisse's voice called out again, and now she was sounding the charge. Davian saw members of the congregation break to a run on either side of her, funneling through the streets in a great rush, wielding hammers and pry bars and power cutters, emptying their shotguns and automatics into the Skitarii wedge. The dragoons were in motion instantly, striding over the heads of the human-sized allies, accelerating to a countercharge with lances lowered. Davian saw the first connect, its huge iron feet sending insurgents flying even as the lance swept up. Then an eye-reddening beam of light seared into it. One of the mining crews had a rock light laser set up on the rooftop across from Davian, and they drew lines of molten steel across the dragoon's chassis before striking something vital. In an instant, the walking machine flashed incandescently and exploded, laying waste to the nearest fighters and a horrible toll of shrapnel and shredded flesh. For anyone left standing, though, that was the signal to rush forwards. Moments later, the Skitarii were giving ground, shooting and falling back, or just falling, dragged down by the crowd, who saw them as nothing more than the tools of their oppressors. And Davian was off, roof to roof, eyes open for when the tech priest's more subtle instruments decided the higher reaches were their territory. There would be rangers up here, sniping down at the crowd soon enough. There would be murderous rush stalkers trying to flank the congregation, to bring down its leaders with their blades and claws. She had to be ahead of all that. She had work to do, a task trusted to her by the Magus herself. She shadowed the forerunners of the mob until they exploded out before the Nelidium Square, where the rail depot was. Some of the Palladium's troops were disembarking even as everyone arrived, hurriedly evacuating the train and taking up position to defend it. If the congregation wished to reach the Palladium, they needed to control the train line, and they needed to take it swiftly before the tech priests began destroying their own infrastructure to the rebels. There were more than just Scutari out there. She saw the low, trundling shapes of Cataphren servitors, grinding down the ramps from flatbed carriages. Armored human head, torso, and arms set into a mechanized assault vehicle that was also their lower body. Davian felt a flare of rage at the tech priests and their meddling. They took the divine flesh and carved it and pared it down, merging it with their devices. Nothing could be left alone. Nothing had any value until it was incorporated into their machines. And, on a greater scale, no individual lives had worth unless they were components of the wider priestly engine that spanned the human universe and enslaved everything it touched to their cold metal vision. The Cataphren were terrors, nigh invulnerable to the weapons of the foot soldiers of the congregation. But by now, the rioters had been given the chance to bring their own big guns. With a choking roar and a belch of smoke, one of the big quarry trucks raced out of a side street, already up to its lumbering top speed. It was a heavily armored Goliath model, its entire front given way to rock-grinding blades that would chew hungrily on Scutari machine flesh, or the armor of the Cataphren. And in its wake, a flurry of robed figures bearing a banner showing that familiar many-armed figure. The aunts and the uncles had come out from their cellars and holes, from their forgotten wall spaces, where they had waited for generations. Even as the Goliath powered forward, meeting the lead Cataphren head-on, and making a jagged mess of its armor, the elders were leaping around over it, brandishing knives, pistols, or just their own hooked talons. And there was more. Davian felt a voice in her head then, a singing so pure and beautiful that she thought it must be the angels come at last. All the congregation must have heard it, from the way they redoubled their pace and closed joyously with the Scutari machines. A great figure, head and shoulders over the rank and file, had come into the square, a great aunt, one of the true elders, shrouded in streamers and rags of cloth that could not hide the divinity of her form. She sang, and the congregation echoed her, voices upraised in prayer and praise. It was one of her three hands, was a banner, not the crude handmade things the crowd had spent last night creating, but something ancient, preserved for this day over generations. It showed not the expected imperial visage, but an emblem with the same long-jawed head and a trailing cog-back body, a serpentine shape, curled in upon itself. One end a hooked claw, the other hungering jaws, ready to devour the tech priests in all their works. The Scutari turned their weapons on her, blasting away. But the banner had electrified the congregation, so that they were swarming the lines, clambering over the Cataphren, braving the massed fire of their foes. Davian saw explosives go off, mining charges, devastating bodies on both sides. She saw brutal knots of night work, and bayonets, and the bludgeoning butts of carbines. No quarter given. She saw the Scutari and the rear embarking on the train and knew her cue had come. Nobody was watching for one young woman to come off down the rooftops and stow away on the train. And when she stowed away, she wore her palladium robes and revealed her electus so that they accepted her as one of their own. And they were in full retreat, those who could escape the crowd, packing into the train and riding it away to deny it to the insurgents. The miners would bring their own trains from the works, and they'd repair the rails where the Skitarii broke them. They were nothing if not industrious, and they'd been making and mending for generations to the taskmaster's orders. Now, all that know-how would be turned against the hand that held the whip. And by then, Davian was already speeding off towards Auctority's central districts, towering towards the arena, and beyond that, to the walls of the Palatium. Time goes by. As far as Davian could work out, the tech priests themselves weren't treating the uprising as serious yet. That gave her hope. There were a lot of Skitarii assembled at the arena, where the festivities were to begin, and they were at parade ground attention, waiting to receive their master's blessing and benediction. The other troops, down from the ships, seemed to have mostly pulled back to barracks near the Palladium, and she saw Triskelion's hand in that. He was stage managing this little insurrection after all. As she left the train, she got glimpses of them disembarking from the void dock, and something about them sent a shiver through her. They seemed quite different to the Skitarii she was used to. War had toughened them up, scuffed the shine on their metal parts, and she knew Triskelion would be deploying them when he'd won whatever he was after with his little war game. Even compared to the tech priest's regular toy soldiers, the returnee battalion seemed faceless and untouchable, different. For a moment, she found herself with an unaccountable desire to approach them, to test the limits of her own identity by going to peer into their lenses and the slits of their helms. She shook it off. She had work to do. Her electus sufficed to get her beneath the arena. Overhead, the various sects and divisions of the Adeptus Mechanicus were taking their places in the baked stone seating. She could hear their grating hymns, croaked out of metal throats and speakers. They were working themselves up into clinical devotion, ready for their entertainment. Down beneath the arena floor were more of their glass cells, where all those judged unfit were being held. The injured and the maimed, the sick, those born incomplete, those who couldn't work, and those touched visibly by the many-handed emperor's blood, of course. All those not fit to be included in the great, endless, pointless work the tech priests devoted their hollow lives to. Above, in the center of the arena, they would have the furnaces ablaze, a great cauldron seething, preparing to make offerings to their own vision of God. She understood the theology all too well. Just as the fires of a smelter purified raw material, so the arena furnaces would symbolically purify the population of Murad, so it might be forged into the tools the adepts required. But this was the one concession Clarisse had won from the tech priest. The glass cells were designed with an integral flaw, so that, if necessary, they could be shattered. If a certain frequency sounded from the control mechanisms, they would all explode at once. The air, a brief hell of razor shards. And now Davian crept into the tunnels beneath, clambering through the spaces where the ancient gears had stilled, where pistons had half-rusted closed. As the close confines shook the detonation of the first pyrotechnics above, she squeezed her skinny frame through the hatches, forever open just wide enough. and to the cells were below. Many of those caught here would never be able to fight. The conscription pool had taken in many hundreds across the city, though, and they were ordered by the clave, meaning the congregation were mostly still together. Many of them showed the marks of divinity strongly, watching the servitors and junior priests hungrily through the glass. There were more than a few claws and fangs among them. And then there was Sakiri, ready for her own central role in the festivities. They had her hooked to that 5-limbed frame, pinned there like a specimen. Great bundles of cables ran to every part of it now, and Davian knew they would lift her up through a hatch and present her like a banner. They would run current through her until she glowed like a sun, searing her to ash even as the priests chanted and sang their soulless hymns. Not if I can help it. A quartet of bored junior tech priests presided over the banks of levers and switches that governed the cells. They were playing some game together, running mathematical sequences on their steel fingers to rules opaque to Davian. Still, the Scutari were within the earshot, and all their electus and her subservient act wouldn't suffice to have them let her at the controls. Man, that was tough, Adrian. That part was tough, Adrian. That was soup. Okay. A more lasting diversion would be necessary. On the lower decks, she found one of the ubiquitous steel cases the tech priests used to carry important missives. Just the middle tube, the ornamental reliefs of exterior worn almost smooth by decades of handling. A tube that was meant for rolled scrolls, but which would fit together, but which would fit another object of a similar shape and size. Her heart was hammering in her chest now. She had lived with one foot in the world of the Palladium for so long, but after this act, she would finally become a true revolutionary, just like Sakiri. And then, feeling every second rush past, she scrambled up to the gantry, to the priests, and presented them brightly with the case. Urgent message from the Fabricator General, adepts. And that made them feel important, and they clustered around it, opening it to see the last second of the mining charge's burning fuse. Davian had thrown herself back down the length of the gantry, so the explosion took her and shook her, but no more. The sound thundered back and forth in the enclosed space, and she could only hope it was masked by the pyrotechnics above. She looked, finding 3 splayed, scorched bodies. Only 3? Halfway to the lever, she found the 4th. He'd been swifter than his fellows, or hidden behind them. He'd been hanging off the gantry by one cybernetic arm now. He hauled himself up to her, before her, smoking slightly. The lens of his artificial eye cracked. "You!" he started. And doubtless he'd been shouting for help next. And the explosion would probably have Scutari already on their way. She had no time. No time to invent a story, no time to bow, to apologize, to cringe and beg. She found there was none of that lifelong timidity left now. The detonation had driven it out of her. Instead, she leaned on the half-dazed tech priest and tore at him with her nails and her teeth even. She drove her thumbs into his throat and worried at the cables that ran from his eye socket until she'd bitten through them. She beat his skull against the twisted gantry railing, aware of all the prisoner's eyes on her, of Sakiri's eyes. And at last he stumbled back, flailing, and she threw her weight against him. And then he was out beyond the broken rail, clawing at the air, falling in a tangle of panicked flesh and broken mechanisms until he crashed down between the bell jars and was still. And she felt only elation. She felt as though the Emperor's very angels leant close to the world to tell her she had done well. A mad grin was stretching around the corners of her mouth. Happy Ascension Day, she thought, and began pulling levers. maybe. Day of Ascension, Day of Ascension, Day of Ascension, Day of Ascension. Ascension Day. The nice thing about this book is there are no heroes. There's no heroes. But I like that it goes beyond good and evil because like the tech, Triskelion, he's neutral and maybe in this case, like I mean, I reading it aloud this time. I think I skipped over it last time just because there's so much dialogue, but the way that Magus Clares speaks about, like, I understand now. I understand why, like, they have almost a moral justification for, like, bringing in the Tyranid menace to consume the world. I understand why now. They see mankind, they see the Imperium of Man as, like, this terrible old machine that's just, like, cranky and, like, rusty. And it is definitely not an optimist's paradise at all. It'd be a pessimist paradise if they can appreciate paradise, right? They have so much to complain about. So basically, by like consigning themselves to these alien overlords being consumed, their genetic material will remain. It won't be them. It'll be the blueprint for them, and that will be made into new, terrible, killing creatures, and their own biomass will be turned into soup and drunk in like a mosquito straw. But even then, they see it as a way to create eternal life eternal. And I mean, I guess it is in a way, because Tyranids don't die unless you kill them. And they don't even really die even if you kill them a lot of times. But another interesting thing is that Davian is aware that she is a mutant. And it seems like all of her humanity is just a guise. All the normal things about her is just a fucking facade. Well, slightly, at least half so. Yeah, she is two-faced for sure, but they all are. Brazellum couldn't really recline, what with his body lacking anything approaching a waist. Instead, he was up on his dais, overlooking the arena grounds, eating spiced mercury, sweetmeats, and making sneering observations to Aloysia. Down below him on the arena's plastered field was the great Ambelic, into which all the wretched offerings would be decanted at the height of the festivities. The servitors at the chemical fires beneath it up to a fine blaze. The fires leaping blue and green and white, as Brazillum applauded each change. His particular cronies of the moment were up on the podium with him, sitting at his many feet and feigning appreciation of the man's illicit humors. And Triskelion, of course, not as a favorite, but as a butt of those witticisms, wearing the invisible fool's hat of the chief festivator. And if Brazellum was surprised by the stoicism with which he bore it all, the man didn't show it. Probably the fabricator general thought that he had old Viscaro well and truly whipped. Well, let him. The little vox bead he had wired into his ear was giving him a scattershot picture of the congregation's uprising and the South Chasm, and it was all going perfectly satisfactorily. They put on a good show, and the local forces had been swamped by them, and they were pulling back to the central districts of the city. The word would be with Brazellum soon enough. It would have reached him sooner, save that Triskelion had inserted himself into the chain of communication and was keeping a lid on the pot to let it get up to boil. The Marad forces he had direct control of, that should have descended on the whole sordid squabble and pinned the rioters within the South Chasm, were following his meticulous instructions to the letter, holding themselves ready to intervene without actually doing it. Meanwhile, Alpha Primus Tintangrim was still disembarking more of his returnees, building them in garrisons near the Palladium to await Triskelions' word. He was walking a very narrow line. If anyone ever discovered just what had gone on in Ectorites today, somehow unearthed all the communications logs, or dug up the precise commands Triskelion had given over to the various Skitarii squads, then his name would indeed be known in the annals of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but only as an arch-heretic. He was painfully aware that nobody would understand that he only had the orders good at heart. Sometimes we must do these things toward the greater end. My God, Adrian. My God, Adrian. Why? Why did that? Why? That paragraph was 2 sentences, and that it was a mighty paragraph. It just kept going. Brazillum had plainly just made out some barbed remark at his expense. The stained look on Triskelion's face evidently pleased him. A moment later, a very junior tech acolyte was tilting up the steps to reach the Fabricator General, wheezing as his artificial lungs lagged behind his exhortations. He had a scroll in one hand, which he preferred wordlessly. Triskelion had practiced, and had been practically tracking the vanguard of news as it raced from the rail depot to the Palladium, and then, finding Brazellum absent, rebounded off in the direction of the arena. He braced, because he was one juncture where his calculations were strung out over an abyss of uncertainty. He had to make sure the Fabricator General did not make any overly wise decisions right now. Already standing, Brazellum nonetheless gave the impression of leaping to his feet. "What?" he demanded. What? "They dare threaten our glorious celebration?" He stared out about him at their blank faces and then kicked out at the nearest of them, enraged by their mute incomprehension. "Some rabble of workers is marching about in the poor districts, burning things and complaining," he said, as though the latter was worse than ever the former could have been. "Some mob of ingrates who dare slip their collar and run riot and affront to our sacred order on the very day we celebrate. Does the tool turn to bite the hand of the enginseer?" His mouth opened to start the bellowing orders, and Triskelion recognized his cue. "But, Fabricator General, surely this is nothing our Skitarii cannot put down." And truly, it wouldn't have mattered what he'd said right then. He'd been the lightning rod for Brazellum's temper plenty of times before. The key element was grabbing the man's attention at just the right time, so that he'd become a stand-in for all Brazellum's foul temper and frustration. "This is your fault!" the Fabricator General roared, voice resounding through the bell of his body. "You're my chief festivator, Triskelion! You're supposed to see that everything runs properly!" "Fabricator General," Triskelion pitched his voice to carry out all the priests around, "if our resources weren't so tied up with these festivities right now, to remind those of like mine just how Brazellum's priorities were pulling everything out of shape." "You dare blame me?" And in making the accusation, Brazellum was unwittingly planting the thought in everyone's minds. "This is what happens when you let the soft sciences manage everything, all inexact and things leaking everywhere. It wouldn't have happened on anyone else's watch." "Truer than you know," thought Triskelion. "Fabricator General, our Skitarii will have it all in hand. I'll see to it personally." "You certainly shall," Brazellum told him. Aloysia, can you believe the man? A day or so, he was saying he'd be fit to fill your shoes, and now he can't even organize a festival without the rabble rising up to spoil everything? After After this is over, I want squads in every clave in South Chasm. I want a member of every household whipped in the street. I want ringleaders excruciated publicly. This isn't the end of this, Viserial. I'll have your hide too, if you don't do your cursed job. Triskelion worked hard at looking suitably chastised and thinking, oh, you're right. This isn't the end at all. He stood and backed off, retreating up to rake the seats so that he could connect by the Vox to Tin Tangrim without any danger of being overheard. The tech priests eligible to witness the centerpiece of the celebration were mostly assembled now, gathered like a red stain about the stairs surrounding the podium. Admission was a coveted privilege. The place could have held 4 times the number. They could have emptied the Palladium and lined the steps with acolytes and clerks and all the little people who actually made sure everything was clean and everyone got fed. But Berzelem was jealous of his pleasures. Only those he chose to invite, or were so senior he couldn't exclude them, got to see with their own eyes. Berzelem's greedy eyes were back on the Embellic. A choir had assembled before the bubbling cauldron, their perfectly modulated voices rising up over the hubbub of the crowd, amplified by their own implants. Their performance was beautiful, a purity of tone and harmony expressing the deep truths of mathematics, without approaching anything so mundane as melody. Triskelion wasn't a music lover. He appreciated the equations that formed the composition, but felt the cold perfection of the work ring hollow. Adept. 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 The distant, staticky voice of Tin Tangrim. Alpha Primus, your disposition. He surveyed his mental map of auctorities. The wretched southern districts here, where the insurgents were surging from, the arena here, and beyond it, the walls of the Palladium complex, where his final trap would be sprung. Tin Tangrim gave him information in clipped, efficient terms. Numbers of disembarked Skitarii, their disposition to the various garrison sites Triskelion had authorized, all within easy strike of the Palladium. None directly in the path of the rioters. Perfect. At least for Triskelion's purposes. But he sensed that Tin Tangrim was at least curious as to the odd orders. No questions, because it wasn't for Skitaritus to query a tech priest. But the man nonetheless managed to insert an interrogative twist to his words. An uncertain commander might mean uncertain troops, and Triskelion would need them to act decisively and fast when he needed them. Describe morale levels within your squads, Alpha Primus, he ordered. A pause, as Tin Tangrim waited up what must have seemed an odd question. We are content, Adept. It is a momentous day. We have returned to our first world after seeing so many. I am to lead troops in prayer of thanks for our deliverance from the warp. The simplicity of the man's response made Triskelion feel suddenly wretched. After seeing so many? And if Triskelion tried to explain what he was doing and how he intended to use Tin Tangrim's people as part of his plan, how miserable would that make him sound? How petty to drag them into a squabble about who should direct the fortunes of a single orb and the vast angry cosmos. No, it is important. Marad deserves better than Berzelem's excuses, he thought. Give thanks, he told the Alpha, thinking. And we may all shortly have much to give thanks for. And then the fireworks had resumed, and he ended the conversation and returned to his seat, trying to seem like a man who'd been putting down an insurrection. A great battery of explosives roared away around the Ambelic, sending flares of red and orange, blue and silver high into the air. Skulls and gears, Geometric shapes and numerical proofs flashed in momentary glory across the heavens. Fragments of burning foil and powder rained down on the arena like stars. Waste, Triskelion thought. Everything Brazilm touched became a pointless sink of resources. From these festivities to the man's damned art, which I will consign to the fires myself, and let that be the last thing burned on this world that does not go to fuel an engine, he thought. The last of the fireworks thundered away, and he wondered what the other thunder sounds was covering. What other thunder the sound was covering. He was tracking up the uprising. The congregation's vanguard had reached the rail depots of the inner city by whatever cobbled together means they could manufacture. The civil defense Scutari were making a game attempt to bottle them up there, but it wouldn't last for long. Not without all the troops Triskelion was withholding. He felt a weird exhilaration, a man playing both sides of a strategic game for the highest stakes. And there was a vast murmur of interest throughout the gathered priesthood, because it was time for the main event. The chemical coals under the embellic had reached an eye-searing purple, and the roiling molten metal within was ready for its special ingredient. He heard the winches and the engines beneath the arena groaned alive, and the big hatches opened. Up came the bell jars, to be hoisted up to the scaffolding and then tipped out one by one, so that all that was imperfect on Murad would be symbolically purified and transfigured. Up came the excruciation frame, all wired, so that its 5-armed occupant could be lit up and made to jerk and dance and spark, a living firework to burn and writhe for hours, for the greater glory of progress and knowledge. Except the bell jars were just shattered sloughs of glass. Except the frames, cups, and straps hung loose. Crouching atop what had been intended as her own implement of torture and death was Sekiri, hideous in her abomination. They'd left her with little for modesty, of course, and so the whole articulated carapace of her skin was visible. The horror of her head, purplish skin stretched tight over a long curve of her inhuman skull. She had a carbine in 2 of her hands, and the bulk of an arc pistol in the 3rd. And none of that boded well for the Scutari who'd been tending to the prisoners. The final firework cracked its thunder across the sky, and left only a dreadful, appalled silence in its wake. The whole select gathering of tech priests, frozen in horror at what they were seeing. For a moment, Triskelion was wrong-footed. This wasn't part of the plan. And yet, of course it had been. The horrible old woman who led the congregation had asked for the emergency release frequencies, and he had given them to her. He was standing a little ahead of the rest, ready to shuffle back, and he sent himself for the Scutari. Damn. Diet milk, brought to you by Milk. Basically, oh no, I already talked about the cows. Sekiri, the 3-armed monster, stared at them, all with alien eyes. She cocked the deformed head back and cried out to them, "Do I disappoint you, taskmasters? Is this not what you wish to see?" Her 3 arms spread wide, showing them the full horror of her warped frame. And then the others were swarming up from below, All the impurities that were to have been seen so ceremoniously burn away. And yes, many of the offerings were genuine mutants, or just mauled by accident or mischance of birth, but a fair number of the offerings had been Sakiri's kin and gathered all together in one place. It showed too many devotions from the human, which all led in the same direction. Too many ridgy skins of that same purple tone. Too many distended jaws and elongated skulls. Noseless faces. Jagged fangs. Extra arms. The multiplication of these symptoms led to the inescapable detection of the Xenos. Security cried out to a rabble. Tear them down. Drag them from their lofty seats and show them what it's like down here in the dirt. Death to the taskmasters. She unleashed her guns at the crowd. The pistol was just flash and flame at that range, but the carbine drilled a mid-ranking cybersmith through his still organic throat. Some of the others had proper weapons. The rest just had stolen tools or shards of glass, or talons sprouting where fingers should have been. All of them were swarming forwards, those with the alien taint at the fore, and the mere mutants and invalids forming up as best they could. And Skatari were shooting them down. But there weren't so many here in the arena after all. They were all at the rail depot, failing to keep the main thrust of the uprising contained. Triskelion! Berzelm was at his elbow. How has this happened? Betrayed, Fabricator General, the first words came to Triskellion's mouth, sounding sincere because he knew them to be true. And having drawn that little line himself, he was automatically standing on the same side of it as Berzelm's. Aloysia, our festival! And the man was genuinely more upset that this little celebration had been spoiled than that there were armed monsters throwing jagged glass into the roiling mass of his own people. And Sakiri, surging forwards, guns never silent, her eye on Berzelm. I could abandon him here. Let her kill him. Not the plan, but not a bad plan for all that. Except Berzelm had his elbow. Because here with his Qatari to escort Triskelion away, and he wondered, for just a cut-off moment, whether he could simply kill the Fabricator General here, now, and be done with it. But that was a step he couldn't order the soldiers to take. Too evidently against their inbuilt priority list. Too many witnesses. Bide your time, Triskelion. Then Aloysia's great Castellan robot was lumbering to stand between the jagged escapees and Berzelm, rather than actually wading to the fray where it might have been useful. Viscero! Berzelm still had his elbow and hauled him close. What have you done? And for a moment, he thought the Fabricator General had seen it all, the whole seditious plot. Even as Berzelm shook him, he stammered for a reply, reaching out to test whether or not he could turn Tangrim's troops against his fellow tech priests in a direct insurrection. But then Berzelm was bellowing, I put you in charge of this! His amplified voice was as loud as the gunfire and the pyrotechnics had been. How can one man be so incompetent? And Triskelion decided narrowly that it was just the spoiled ceremony the man was furious at. Berzelm hadn't even scratched the surface of how wrong things had been to go for him. Retreat to the Fabricator General. Retreat to the palace, Fabricator General, he insisted. I will deal with this, and the city. Triskelion's artificial ear was still ringing with urgent dispatches from the rail depot. The insurrectionists had a solid beachhead there now, pushing outwards toward the heart of the city, even as more of them came up the rails. Sakiri and tech priests were making panicked reports about monsters, not just the twisted congregation's three-quarter aberrations, but things that had a lot more Xenos in their makeup, the older generation. which meant that, perversely, everything was going according to plan. The nasty little cult had dug out all of its buried scions, just as he'd demanded. When he came to mop them up, he'd get all of them. And Triskelion acknowledged their cries, as his responses only funneled the rioters towards the palace's impregnable gates. Yes, the Palladium, Berzelum confirmed. We will command the defense from there. And though his retreat was anything more than self-preservation, it was almost as if he were part of Triskellion's plan himself. Again, the idea of being the sole player in a complicated game occurred. Here were the insurrectionists, pushing forwards along their intended path, believing that they were winning. Here were the regular Skitarii, pulling back their armor and their troops, and understanding that this is the best way to combat the uprising. Here were 10 Tangrim's hardened veterans, placed in around the Palladium, the jaws of the trap. It was all going like clockwork, despite the untimely release of Sakiri. And if the tech priest couldn't appreciate a well-constructed piece of machinery, who could? Diet milk available at 7-Eleven. Lunk alert! Yeah.